In part one of this two-part video series, I raised the question about whether or not decisive military victories were possible today, and I applied that question to Gaza. In this second video, part two, I'm going to apply the same question to Ukraine and ask the following questions. Is a Ukrainian military victory possible? Is it plausible? And is it even desirable? I'm going to try to answer these questions today in this video. My name is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be in my mind. Now, just to make everything clear, because I think sometimes it's important to put all of one's cards on the table, I am 100% on Ukraine's side in this war. I am an avowed Russophobe. It's not good to be a phobe of anything, but it's just reality. I am. Over 100 years ago, my family fled the Russian Empire. And while there is no family memory of what life was like in the old country, I dare say that I've inherited from being a subject of the Romanov Empire both a Ukrainian family name and a sort of visceral understanding that the Russian Empire was an absolutely terrible place. And everything I've read suggests that it still is. It hasn't gotten any better. So that's where I am. So I'm rooting for the Ukrainians here, and I'm asking these questions not because I'm down on Ukraine or want to sell them down the river, but because I want to ask serious questions. It's all for the sake of analysis and for understanding. Now, there are two things here that I think that we need to two issues here that we need to discuss. One has to do with the military balance and the possibility of a decisive military victory. The second has to do with what a decisive military victory means when we're dealing with a nuclear power. Now remember, it's the advent of nuclear weapons that caused military theorists in the first place to question whether or not decisive military victories were even possible, or maybe they were a thing in the past. And we need to talk about that. We need to talk about the nuclear issue, I think, much more than I think most people today are actually doing. I think there's almost a willingness for people like myself who support Ukraine to try to sweep that under the table and under the carpet and say, it's not an issue. The Russians are just bluffing it. It's not a thing. But let's talk about that. Okay, so let's work through these things one by one. So first of all, I'm going to say that the situation, strategic situation right now in Ukraine reminds me a lot of World War I, with Ukraine being in the place of Imperial Germany. And what I mean by that is that Germany is largely outnumbered, and it has to struggle with the fact that, among other things, it's running out of time. So 1918, it's running out of time. The German leadership understood that the Americans were coming. The Americans were coming in massive numbers. And at some point in 1918, the war was going to be lost by virtue of this great weight that was shifting and the reality of the American intervention. But they really have a dilemma, because as more and more Americans are coming online, that increasingly are outnumbered, and they have this problem where they need to defend this very long front, and they need to defend all of it, and they need to be very careful about their reserves. The Supreme Allied Commander at the time, General Foch, understood his side's advantages, and he wanted to use them as much as possible. Now, what he did was he renounced the idea of any single decisive breakthrough, breakout, decisive battle that had been tried many, many times before in World War I, always with absolutely disastrous results. So his solution was basically to hammer the front here, there, everywhere, often at the same time, forcing the Germans to fix their positions while also husbanding their reserves and trying to cope with all of these attacks going on at the same time. And Foch reckoned that the aggregate effect would be like a decisive battle, because ultimately this was going to break the German army. I believe that Foch likened this to moving a piece of heavy furniture across a room. You can't just pick the thing up and move it. You can't even just sort of push it into place, but rather you've got to give it a shove here and a shove here on the other side and a shove in the middle, and just sort of like little by little doing all these sort of shoves. You kind of, inch by inch, you sort of move this thing into place, and you achieve your objective. And that basically in a nutshell was Foch's strategy. And it was working. It was working very well. Now, if we go back to Ukraine, what we see is that according to the latest work, for example, by the excellent Jack Watling and his colleagues at the Royal United Service Institute, or otherwise his name is RUSI, which is this great UK think tank, what he describes is pretty much the same kind of thing, where the Russian army has renounced trying to defeat the Ukrainian army in any kind of decisive offensive breakthrough battle, in large part because it can't. According to Watling, the officer corps, the Russian officer corps, has been so badly decimated that it no longer has the wherewithal to conduct a large-scale maneuver using divisions and corps and army and that kind of thing. It's all now sort of smaller units, smaller engagements, but everywhere at once, forcing again the Ukrainians to, like, they have to fix their positions. They've got the units have to be on the line. It's hard to rotate the units or relieve them, and they're struggling. And also the Ukrainians really have to husband their very, very scarce resources. So it's a very serious situation here. This is, by the way, as General Uban noted in the conversation I had with him in a previous video, and I've put a link to that in the description. Uban said that the war now is really speaking to the strengths of the Russians and to the disadvantages of the Ukrainians. What the Ukrainians did in 2022 with the Great Russian Offensive is that they let the Russians in. Really, they had no choice. But then what they did is they used these small, autonomous, very flexible, very adaptable units to move around the Russians and hit them on the sides and hit them in the rear and to just tear them apart. And it's really very effective, particularly because the Russians are known for having this sort of classic Soviet top-down command structure, and it's very linear and hierarchical. And the Russians just don't do very well this kind of flexible, adaptive approach that the Ukrainians apparently are much better at. So during the first phase of war, this was great. In the second phase of the war, the Ukrainians now are fighting this kind of linear war that is to their disadvantage. They just can't. Now, whereas in World War I, you had the French side, the Allied side, had the advantage that the Americans were coming, and the Americans also had this great wealth of factories and industry that they could just flood stuff into the Allies. Here, first of all, remember, we're sort of comparing Ukraine to Germany. They don't have that. What's worse is that even though the Russians don't have anybody coming in to help them, but what the Russians do have is that they have depths of a deep pool of manpower and industrial capacity, much greater than Ukraine has. And slowly but surely, this enables the Russians basically to take on, to absorb the attrition. They're not casualty sensitive and they can handle it. It doesn't matter at this point if the Russians have the best people, the best weapons, etc. It doesn't matter if they're using old T-72s or even older stuff. It doesn't matter. What matters are the numbers, the number of tanks, the number of men, the number of units, and the length of the front that they can operate on. All this puts the Ukrainians at a great disadvantage. So what are they going to do? Germany's answer to this situation in 1918 was to attempt a great offensive, the Spring Offensive, Operation Michael, as I believe it's known. And basically, it was like one last gamble, and they were was successful enough that they were able to return to the kind of maneuver warfare that they tried in 1914, but it didn't work, and then the war thus got bogged down to trench warfare. But 1918 now, both sides had the skills that they were much better at this. They had adapted maneuver warfare, so now they're doing it. And it really almost worked. I won't get into why it didn't work, but the point was that they almost pulled it off, and the situation in 1918 was really very dire for the Allies. So the question then becomes, can Ukraine attempt an Operation Michael? It's not clear to me that they can. It's not clear to me that they have the manpower. This also would require a concentration of means, which would require economy of force, which would require pulling troops from certain parts of the line in order to mass them in other parts of the line, which is an extremely risky thing to do, particularly now, because nowadays both sides of this war have reconnaissance capabilities that World War I commanders could only dream about. Actually, this was beyond their wildest imagination. They couldn't do it. So it's a dangerous thing to do. The one way that I think it would be plausible for Ukraine to attempt some sort of Operation Michael would be if they were able to use large amounts of firepower at long range. So I'm talking about things like the ATACMS, the ATACMs, HIMARS, that German missile that the Germans keep refusing to supply, glide bombs, the works, right? That might make it possible. Think of the American air-land doctrine that the American side developed in the late Cold War. And part of the idea of air-land battle, remember, the Americans were thinking in terms of the Soviets having a radical numerical superiority. So the idea was to try to counter that by, among other things, using long-range precision fires to get at the Soviet second and third and fourth echelons before they got anywhere near the front. Is this possible? I think ultimately maybe that depends really on the quantities with which the Ukraine's Western partners supply these sorts of things to the Ukrainian military. Yes, it's true that the Americans finally have passed the bill that they needed to pass, and they're finally sending more and more of this stuff to Ukraine. But I don't know if the United States and the others are supplying these kinds of weapons in anywhere near like the volume that they need to in order to enable Ukraine to return to the offensive and to retake the initiative and to attempt this kind of Operation Michael. But here we need to stop and we need to be philosophical about this. And this is where we get into the question of the desirability of a decisive major battle or a decisive major offensive. Let's put the question in these terms. In order for a decisive battle to be at a scale, a decisive offensive to be at a scale that would actually achieve Ukraine's strategic objectives, it would have to be pretty big. So, first of all, what would this look like? And I imagine looking something like this classic sort of encirclement battle, the old school kind. This is what the Germans did in the Blitzkrieg, and this is what the Soviets did. The idea is that I think they called it a Kesselschlacht. Like you go in and you encircle a large formation, and then you destroy it or you force it to surrender. It works. It's very effective. Something on the scale where, and it's got to be a large scale. You're not talking about wiping out a battalion. You're talking about wiping out, like at the very least, divisions. But I'm thinking more like armies and corps, something really very large. And this is what it takes. So the objective here is to cause the Russian army so much damage that it is not or no longer in a position to continue what it was doing in its pursuit of the war aims. Basically saying it cannot do what it had set out to do anymore because of the damage done by this offensive maneuver. If what it takes to defeat the Russian army is causing it a tremendous amount of pain, and Russians are really, the Russian army in particular, but I think the Russian public, I think, has a capacity for pain that I don't think we have, and I think we've underestimated this. So it's got to be really big. But if it's really that big, what might that provoke Russia into doing, right? If it takes tremendous pain to defeat Russia, then the more pain, the more effective, but the more likely you might provoke the Russians to do something very serious. So let's imagine we go back to our World War I scenario. Let's imagine that France had nuclear weapons back then. Think about the summer of 1914, summer of 1918, when Paris once again is in jeopardy. It's entirely possible that the Allied war effort could collapse. Would France have used nuclear weapons in the summer of 1914 or 1918? I mean, French nuclear doctrine today very, very clearly, to the extent that it's clear at all, but I think absolutely endorses the use of nuclear weapons in this kind of scenario. I think France, in arming itself with nuclear weapons, is basically saying there will be no more battles of the Marne. So they would use them. Would Russia, if faced with a decisive defeat, would Russia use them? Now, of course, these situations are not entirely analogous. Summer of 1914, not summer, but fall of 1914, First Battle of the Marne, and then later, the Second Battle of the Marne, France is in dire trouble. In this kind of scenario I'm talking about, Ukrainian offensive wouldn't place Russia in dire trouble in the sense that Ukraine was threatening Russia, right? Moscow is not within reach. I can't imagine the Ukrainians being able to threaten any major Russian city. It's not about a military fate of the entire country. The country's not going to fall. Ukraine cannot invade and occupy Russia. This is an absurdity. But what they can do is they can, by destroying the Russian army's ability to continue its operations, they can put Putin in jeopardy. They can put the Russian government in jeopardy. They can, the political fallout of such a large defeat could be very, very serious. And Putin's got to worry about all these things. He has to worry about his own survival. He has to worry about his own hold on power. So would he be tempted to do something that would completely change the entire scenario and thus put the entire war in a much more dangerous footing, in peril all of us, ultimately? And I think that the answer to that needs to be taken seriously. I think that the answer to that might be yes. Now, at the moment, from what I've seen, most of the analysts who follow this and talk about Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons, and this is something that Putin has made a few times, the consensus is that they're full of it. They're bluffing. This is nonsense. And, everybody's like, just ignore it. Maybe they're right. except that this is what we're talking about is an entirely different scenario. So now suddenly you have a situation where an entire Russian, say an army, is about to be destroyed. Imagine like this happened in Stalingrad when finally I think it was the entire Russian army German army had to surrender to the Soviets. This is something similar. Then, of course, we have to answer the question or ask the question, well, what if they do? Would the Russian use of nuclear weapons against either the Ukrainian military, tactical weapons, or Ukraine itself? Would that necessarily push all of us onto some perilous escalatory ladder? The end of which being apocalypse, right? We don't want that. Nobody wants that. But they might nuke Ukrainian divisions, or they might nuke Kiev. What happens then? Much depends then on how we react, because obviously we can't do nothing, but we might have to do something. But what? And is any kind of possibility worth it? Like, how dangerous is that? So I don't really know the answer to this, but obviously there's a real risk here. There's a risk that if Ukraine were to win a decisive battle or a decisive offensive, that Russia might use nuclear weapons. And then we need to think about, well, what then? And what can we do in response to that isn't sort of guaranteeing that all of us find ourselves on this escalatory ladder that ends to the end of the world, potentially. We're kind of left with some options here. One option is to try to kind of continue what we're doing now and just sort of helping Ukraine manage this war of attrition, which I don't think is really tenable because of the numbers, because of the manpower, because of Russia's advantages, because of Russia's greater numbers, greater manpower, reserves, greater industrial capacity, their greater tolerance for pain. I don't think this is working. I think that Ukraine's like on a clock now, particularly given the possibility that the United States might end its support. You see what's going on in Congress, and then Trump could win the election, and then what happens? So again, we're like 1918. The Germans are looking at the clock and thinking, if we don't do something now, we're going to lose this war anyways. So maybe we need to take the risk. So I'm kind of thinking that we kind of have to take the risk, that Ukraine has to take the risk and attempt an Operation Michael, which would lead to outcomes that we can't be sure of, and outcomes that could be really terrible. I suppose ultimately it's up to Zelensky to decide that. But then we, as the allies, friends, partners, need to think about this. Well, what happens in that kind of scenario? How great is the risk? And if he does use nuclear weapons, then how great is the risk of us finding ourselves in an escalatory ladder? Now, clearly, so far from what we've seen, the White House does not want this. And I think this is the reason why part of the reason why Washington has been so reticent up till now to supply Ukrainians with the kinds of weapons that I'm talking about, the kinds of weapons that enable Ukraine to reach deeply behind Russian lines and ultimately into Russia itself, because they kind of need to do that, particularly if we're thinking like air-land battle, for fear of this escalating into something bigger. And I believe that the hope on the part of the White House was that we could do something in the middle, like, we defend Ukraine, yes, but don't enable them to do a decisive offensive battle, and do something in the middle that's less dangerous from a point of view of escalation, and hope that also sanctions and other things kick in, and ultimately the Russians end up thinking twice and say, all right, maybe this is not a good idea. That does not seem to be working for a lot of reasons, including the fact that Russians seem to be very good at getting around sanctions. Plus, the Chinese are helping them. Plus, other people are helping them. Sanctions are like, it's not watertight. It's more like a colander. And it clearly hasn't stopped the Russian industry from being able to support the war effort. They're clearly able to do this. Either we risk an Operation Michael, some sort of offensive, spring offensive, or somehow we think up another solution. Is there some alternative that we haven't thought of that might enable Ukraine to regain the initiative and to do real harm to the Russian army, but without running the risks that seem to be associated with a real decisive battle? So thank you very much. Please like and subscribe. Also check out in the description, I put some links to my Substack Pax Americana, as well as to the videos that I mentioned. And I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Thank you.